In the spring of 1962, a coal miner by the name of Elias Heartwell made his way down into a shaft beneath Centralia, Pennsylvania, one that had remained sealed for nearly 30 years. He carried with him a carbide lamp, a canvas tool bag, and a map drawn by hand, given to him by a retired company foreman. By the time Heartwell was brought back to the surface, 14 hours later, his hair had turned the color of bone ash, his lamp was gone, and for 9 days, he refused to utter a single word. When he finally did speak, the first thing he said was that the deepest beam in that mine had not been made by any company, any union, or any man he had ever heard of. The second thing he said was that something down there was still using it. This is the account of what Elias Heartwell claimed to have discovered beyond that final beam. Before we go any further, do me a favor. If you find these forgotten stories as compelling as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds its way to you when it drops. The algorithm has a tendency to bury this kind of investigation unless you indicate otherwise. Heartwell was born in 1919, in a row house owned by the Lehigh Valley Coal Company. His father worked the seams. His grandfather worked the seams. By the time Elias was 16, he was already 800 feet underground. What distinguished him was that he paid attention to the old men. He listened when retired miners told stories about German engineers who appeared in 1903 with surveying equipment nobody could identify. He listened when an Irish priest mentioned a chamber his grandfather had walked into back in 1881, one that had Latin writing carved into the stone, despite the fact that no Roman had ever set foot in the Allegheny region. And he listened when his own father, drunk on a December night in 1939, told him the Lehigh Valley Coal Company had explicit written orders never to dig past a certain depth in the number 7 shaft. That last detail is the one that matters. In February of 1962, a retired foreman named Wilhelm Brandt knocked on Heartwell's door and asked him a question that nobody had asked anyone in 30 years. Brandt asked if he wanted to see what was at the bottom of number 7. Number 7 had been sealed in 1933. Officially, the reason was a methane pocket that had killed 2 surveyors. Unofficially, according to Brandt, the surveyors had not been killed by methane. Brandt had been the foreman on duty the day the shaft was sealed, and he had spent the next 3 decades trying to forget what he had personally pulled out of that hole. Now, dying of black lung in a rented room in Shamokin, he wanted one more man to see what he had seen, so the knowledge would not perish with him. Brandt was no crank. He was a German-trained engineer who had signed off on the structural integrity of more than 400 shafts. The closure report he filed for number 7 contained a single sentence in his own handwriting. It read, in translation, that the shaft had been closed because what lay below could not be safely worked by the men they had. No mention of methane. Just a sentence suggesting there were men who could safely work whatever was down there, and the Lehigh Valley Coal Company was not employing them. Heartwell agreed to go. He was 43, divorced, and tired of pretending the stories he had listened to as a boy were merely stories. The descent took place on the night of April 11, 1962. Brandt could not accompany him, but he sat at the surface with a kerosene lantern and a hand-drawn map, feeding Heartwell instructions through a field telephone rigged into the shaft. The map showed 27 beams. The shaft, according to Brandt, had been deliberately mismeasured in the official records. The real depth was nearly twice what the map indicated. And past the 27th beam, the timber stopped being timber. The first 1,000 feet were unremarkable. The walls were the same blue-black anthracite Heartwell had grown up staring at. He counted beams as he descended. Each beam was numbered in faded white paint. And at every 5th beam, there was a small iron plaque bolted into the rock. The plaques did not carry the Lehigh Valley Coal Company logo. They carried no logo Heartwell recognized. They bore a symbol that looked, in his words, like a wheel within a wheel, surrounded by writing that was unmistakably not English, not German, and not Latin. At beam 20, the temperature shifted. It did not grow colder, it grew warmer. At beam 23, the rock around him ceased to be anthracite. Heartwell later described it as a kind of polished black stone, smooth as glass, with veins of something metallic running through it that caught the light from his carbide lamp and cast it bouncing in directions the lamp itself was not pointing. At beam 26, the field telephone went dead. Brandt's voice was gone. There was no static. Just silence. He was somewhere around 4,000 feet down. The official depth of number 7 was 2,200. He had passed that mark almost an hour earlier. He kept going. Beam 27, when he reached it, was not wood. The shape was the same. The material was something Heartwell had no name for. It was warm to the touch through his glove. It was nearly black, but it caught the lamplight in directions that made no geometric sense, and it was carved. The entire beam was covered in shallow lines that formed shapes Heartwell could only describe as letters that had been melted halfway back into the material they were cut from. He nearly turned around. He would tell people for the rest of his life that turning around would have been the smart thing. But he did not turn around. The shaft below beam 27 changed character entirely. The rough, irregular walls of a hand-cut mine gave way to something unmistakably engineered. The passage became cylindrical. The floor was level. There were no tool marks. There were no blast scars. The walls were the same polished black stone, and at regular intervals were what Heartwell described as alcoves, each holding a single object. He did not touch any of them. He kept walking. A miner descending into a sealed Pennsylvania coal shaft in 1962 should not encounter cylindrical engineered passages with display alcoves cut into polished stone. Somebody had built that corridor, and whoever had built it well before 1933, because beam 27 was on the route in. The corridor predated the company that had supposedly sealed the shaft. This is where the Tartarian thread enters. There is a growing body of independent research suggesting that the official history of North America, particularly the period between 1700 and 1900, is incomplete in ways that mainstream historians refuse to engage with. Buildings appear in old photographs that no records claim were ever built. Cities show up on early maps that no surveyor has ever explained. Architectural styles repeat across continents in patterns that pure cultural diffusion cannot account for. The working name for the civilization that may have left these traces is Tartaria. What is not in serious dispute among researchers willing to look at the evidence is that something is missing from the record. What Heartwell described fits that missing piece almost too neatly. The polished black stone with metallic veining matches descriptions in 19th-century engineering journals that were quietly pulled from circulation after the 1893 Chicago Exposition. The melted writing on the beam matches symbols found on artifacts recovered from mound builder sites in Ohio, artifacts the Smithsonian famously catalogued in 1881, and then, in 1894, declared had never existed. None of this is conclusive. All of it is suggestive. And Heartwell, in 1962, knew none of it. He was just a miner walking down a corridor that should not exist. The corridor ended in a chamber. According to Heartwell's later testimony, the chamber was roughly circular, roughly 40 feet across, and lit. That is the word he used. Lit. There was no lamp, no fire, no obvious source. The room was illuminated by a soft, even glow that came from the walls themselves. He turned off his carbide lamp to make sure he was not imagining it. He was not. In the center of the chamber was what he initially mistook for a piece of mining equipment. It was metallic. It stood about 7 feet tall. It had the general shape of a vertical cylinder mounted on a wider base, with what looked like ports or vents arranged around its circumference. He walked toward it. As he got closer, he realized two things. The first was that the device was humming. The second was that it was warm. A pump abandoned in a sealed shaft for 30 years does not hum. A pump abandoned in a sealed shaft for 30 years does not generate heat. He stopped about 10 feet away and listened. The hum did not have the rhythm of a piston or the whine of a turbine. It was closer, he said, to the sound of a tuning fork that had been struck a long time ago and somehow had not yet stopped vibrating. He did not touch the device. On the far side of the chamber was a doorway. The doorway was sealed. The seal was a flat plate of the same black stone set flush into the door frame with no visible hinge, latch, or seam. In the center of the plate was a single carved symbol. He recognized it. It was the wheel within a wheel. Around the doorway, set into the surrounding stone at eye level, were 6 smaller carvings. 5 were maps. One showed the outline of what might be the eastern coast of North America, but with rivers running in places where no river runs today. One showed a circular continent that does not appear on any modern globe. One showed what looked like the night sky, but with constellations arranged in patterns that no astronomer has been able to match to any era of the past 10,000 years. The 6th carving was a portrait in profile of a face. The face was human, or close enough to human, but the proportions were wrong in a way Heartwell could not quite articulate. He stood at the sealed doorway for somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. He did not try to open it. What he felt, he would say years later, was that the door was not locked to keep something out. It was locked to keep something in. And whatever was on the other side of it was aware of him. That was when his carbide lamp went out. Not flickered, not sputtered. Went out completely, as if someone had reached into the flame and pinched it. The chamber did not go dark. The walls were still glowing. He stood in that soft, sourceless light, 10 feet from a humming machine he could not explain, in front of a sealed door he was suddenly certain he should not open, and he turned around and walked out. When he reached the surface 14 hours after he had descended, the sky was the color of new lead. Brant was still sitting by the kerosene lantern. The old foreman looked at Heartwell's face, looked at his hair, which had gone white during the climb back up, and did not ask him a single question. Brant simply nodded, the way a man nods when something he has been waiting decades to hear has finally been confirmed without a word being spoken. Then he stood up, gathered his lantern and his map, and walked away. Wilhelm Brant was found dead 3 days later. The official cause was complications from black lung. The map he had given Heartwell was not found among his possessions. Heartwell had it. He kept it for the rest of his life. For the next 26 years, Elias Heartwell tried to tell his story. The Lehigh Valley Coal Company informed him that any unauthorized entry was a criminal trespass. A state geologist in 1965 wrote a polite letter back recommending that he consult a doctor. A journalist at the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1971 wrote a 5-paragraph piece treating the whole thing as local folklore. He died in 1988 in a nursing home in Pottsville. The nurse who was with him in his final hours later told a local paper that his last words were something about a wheel that was still turning. Now, here is where the story takes its strangest turn. In May of 1962, just 1 month after Heartwell's descent, a fire was deliberately set in a landfill that sat directly above an exposed coal seam on the edge of Centralia. The fire spread into the seam. It has been burning ever since. By 1984, the town had been declared uninhabitable by the federal government. The population today is fewer than 10 people, and the United States Postal Service revoked the town's zip code in 2002. The official explanation has never adequately addressed several specific questions. It has never explained why the fire has resisted every attempt to extinguish it for over 6 decades. It has never explained why the fire's heat signature, mapped repeatedly by satellite, traces a roughly cylindrical pattern that descends almost vertically into the earth. It has never explained why that heat signature, according to a leaked Department of Energy assessment from 1994, appears to be centered on a point approximately 4,000 feet below the surface, which is well below the depth of any documented coal seam in the area. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was nearly swallowed by a sinkhole that opened up under his feet in his own backyard. The hole, when measured, was found to drop straight down for over 150 feet before steam and superheated gas made further measurement impossible. He grabbed a tree root and survived. Centralia was evacuated soon after, but the fire keeps burning, and the heat signature keeps tracing that cylindrical descent, and somewhere down there, if Elias Heartwell was telling the truth, a humming device sits in a glowing chamber in front of a sealed door carved with a wheel inside a wheel. I am not going to tell you the Centralia fire is a deliberate cover-up. I do not have proof of that. What I am going to tell you is that the official record of why a thriving Pennsylvania town was burned out of existence does not match the available evidence, and that the available evidence, including Elias Heartwell's testimony, points to something underneath that town that nobody in a position of authority wants the public to see. There is one more piece you need to know. In 2009, a researcher named Daniel Vega, working on a doctoral dissertation about pre-industrial mining symbols in the Appalachian region, came across a photograph in a private collection in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The negative had been processed using a technique that fell out of use around 1905. It showed an iron plaque mounted on a timber beam in the interior of a mine shaft. The plaque was engraved with a wheel within a wheel. Vega tried to publish the photograph in 3 different academic journals. All 3 rejected it. He posted it to a personal website in 2011. The website was taken down in 2012. Vega himself stopped publishing in 2013 and has not given a public interview since. The photograph still exists. A handful of researchers have copies. It matches Heartwell's description exactly. Elias Heartwell was not an uneducated man in the way that mattered. He had been underground for 26 years. He knew what coal looked like. He knew what an engineered passage looked like. He knew when his lamp went out in front of a sealed door that he was in the presence of something his civilization had no framework for. And he spent the rest of his life trying to tell us about it, and we did not listen. Maybe it is time we did. If this story moved something in you, share it with one person. Just one. The official history of this country is missing chapters, and the only way those chapters get written is if enough of us refuse to stop asking. I will see you in the next investigation. Until then, count your beams.